you all for being here. So my name is Lagipoiva Cherelle Jackson, which means Sky of Nine Nights. I am of Samoan descent. I am the daughter of a high chief. I was raised by elders. I was raised through ancestral knowledge and in a very strong oral history tradition in Samoa in the South Pacific. So it is indeed a great honor for me to wear my flower, for it is not often in United States gatherings that I can do this without being looked at as weird. It's great to be in a safe space. So I am the director of climate journalism at SJN. And it is my great privilege to integrate Indigenous knowledge into the work that we attempt with our practitioners, our partners, and journalists and newsrooms in the United States. Before we continue, we were supposed to hold this space introduction by Ihi, but we will see if we can attend to that at the end of this gathering. I would like to honor the ancestral knowledge that we will be referring to in this forum in various ways. I would also like to honor the various spaces and traditional holders of the lands that we occupy, and more importantly, the Indigenous knowledge that continues to benefit so many of us, descendants of Indigenous peoples and those who are allies. So in that vein, I would like to urge everyone to ensure that in the information and in the knowledge that is shared today, that you honor and attribute as appropriate to the ancestral and traditional and Indigenous knowledge of the collective, communities that we descend from. So please, with the information that is being shared today and the knowledge imparted, please respect that these are, sorry, someone has a mic.
Great to see you here. I recognize.
Please respect that these, very valuable resources that are shared today should be honored. And if you do quote them as collective to honor that knowledge. So I will now like to invite each speaker to introduce themselves, but before doing so, I will do a brief introduction to honor their lineage. So our first speaker, Melina Lupukan Massimo, has worked on climate justice, Indigenous sovereignty, and women's rights for over 20 years. Melina is Lukon Cree from Northern Alberta, Canada. She is the founder and executive director of Sacred Earth Solar and co-founder of Indigenous Climate Action. Over to you, Melina.
Hi, Tanse, Kakiao. Thank you so much for the welcome and thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Melina. My Cree name is Miawapan, which means beautiful morning, and Labokan Massimo. I am Nihiao in our language, which is from so-called Canada in the north, and I was born in my community of Little Buffalo in a province called Alberta here in so-called Canada, and very happy to be here. I've worked, as was mentioned, on climate issues and environmental justice, and founded two organizations that work on climate up here in so-called Canada, and also a host of a TV show called Power to the People, where we profile Indigenous climate solutions across the country. We went to 26 locations from coast to coast, and we're just privileged and honored to see all of the amazing work that sometimes isn't uplifted as the solutions that we do need to see moving forward in, the climate crisis that we now see ourselves in. I also hold a master's degree in energy transition, and my solar thesis was actually implementing a solar project in my home community that powers our health center, and I think implementing climate solutions, not only just talking about them, but really implementing, one, with Indigenous knowledge, and two, with the innovations that we're able to utilize that are accessible to our community and affordable to our community is also an important one. So we also just released a Just Transition Guide that's 180 pages of this research that helps communities be able to transition and learn more about just transition. And I'm also happy to share that in the link, but I'll stop there. Hi, thank you for having me today.
Audio now.
Thank you, Melina. I really appreciate your time today and sharing your expertise. Our next speaker is Dominique Bikapa. Dominique is a founding member and executive director of Strong Roots Congo. a conservation and sustainable development NGO based in Democratic Republic of Congo. For 20 years, Dominique has worked in design and oversee conservation and sustainable development initiatives that aim to balance the needs of humans with those of forests and wildlife. Dominique, welcome. If you can give us a brief introduction of your work.
Thank you very much, Jackson. I'm calling from the land of Bashi here in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. And our work has been focusing on documenting traditional knowledge and practices which can be, which are relevant and which can be actually associated with formal conservation approaches, so that we can mix both science and traditional knowledge together to deliver conservation outcomes. Because when we talk about climate change, some of us in Western countries tend to go to labs and look in microscopes and things like that. For us, it's real, we live it. And we have to do anything we can to ensure that we adapt or, and I'm happy to join, and thank you again for inviting me to this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic. I appreciate what you just said. My late mother, High Chief Vasily Fiti, always said she did not have a degree, but she always said, I'm a jungle professor, because she can, she can pick any leaf and create traditional medication from that. So I appreciate that very much. I'd now like to invite Alejandro Acumendo. He is the program director of Asociación Andes, a Cusco, Peru-based indigenous peoples organization that focuses its work on independent action research and analysis and fostering new forms of networking and alliance building. Alejandro is the founder of various international indigenous knowledge platforms cooperating within shared goals of protecting and nurturing biodiversity and promoting indigenous food systems and agroecology solutions. Alejandro, welcome. You're on mute. I would love to telepathically hear what you're saying, but if you can, thank you.
Thank you, and also for this opportunity to join this fantastic panel. A little update, and with my apologies. My current work is with Swift Foundation. I'm Director of Programs and Andes Amazon lead of the foundation. Also, I'm currently the international coordinator of the Mountain Indigenous Peoples, a global network of indigenous communities that inhabit mountains. And I'm board member of the Home Planet Fund, a trust fund that supports indigenous peoples and local communities around the world. My work at this moment is focusing on supporting the establishment of an autonomous fund for territorial communities and in Central South America as an financial tool to support actions that the communities will decide from their own perspective and needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandro. Seth, I'm just checking if Ihi is in the room. That's
no, I believe he ended up having a scheduling conflict with the conference he's at, and so I haven't heard back from him yet. But I'll let you know if he joins. Well, it'll be clear when he joins, if he joins.
I was very excited. Our other speaker is Maori Indigenous leader, which is in the South Pacific, New Zealand. So it's very rare to have a fellow Polynesian in the room, but I will just have to move on without my fellow brother. So what you've heard today now in the introductions from our speakers is that they have respective fields of expertise that they've invested their time in utilizing their knowledge, but also drawing out and really delving deeper into the indigenous knowledge that contributes to those solutions. So I just want to invite our speakers to speak to the benefits, or rather the approaches that you take in your respective work on further exploring the Indigenous knowledge within those climate solutions that you work on. I'll invite you, Melina, first, if you will. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. I think for us, you know, we were speaking about this a bit earlier before everyone else signed on, but we work in collectives. So we are not, you know, individuals that are just doing this work ourselves. We come from community, we come from nationhood, and you know, that's what we refer to it here in so-called Canada, where we have our nations. And so the community that I come from, this is collective knowledge that, you know, was taught to me from a very young age. You know, I went on horse and wagon with my Kukumin Muslim, that means grandmother, grandfather in our Nihiao, in our language. And we were able to live off the land. You know, I'm the first generation, but also the last generation that is living off the land, and first generation that didn't attend residential schools. So as you can imagine, the mission schools that impacted our ecological knowledge has been immense, and we are reclaiming that knowledge back, and it needs to have time and respected, but it was also hidden. It was also went underground. It was actually illegal here in so-called Canada until 1961 to practice our spirituality, our traditional values, to even attain a lawyer, to be able to fight land battles. So we actually it's been a long time coming, but the way that we utilize our traditional ecological knowledge is that my dad talks about how our people have always evolved. Our people have always, our culture, is not static. It's an evolution, and we are innovative people, and we have always innovated, and that's how we survived for millennia on our homelands. And so it's really important to safeguard language, culture, and that 80% of the world's biodiversity, I think a lot of us know this, is safeguarded by Indigenous peoples. And so it's incredibly essential to listen to that ecological knowledge and listen to that Indigenous science, because we are literally, you know, at the last people on this planet that are literally keeping Mother Earth alive. You know, there's been so much devastation and destruction, even within our own homelands. And so a lot of our communities have been put in a rock and a hard place. We have become economic hostages in our own homelands, because a lot of times what we are in so-called Canada is a petrostate. And so with the petrostate, a lot of communities actually have been forced to destroy their own homelands to be able to put quote unquote food on the table. So how do we change this? How do we change this type of dynamic? And so for me, as somebody that was looking to find something different, we started to implement solar into our home community. And at the same time, solar is not perfect. We need to be critical about all of the things and the critical minerals that come with even the transition technologies that we're implementing today. And so it's really about understanding the collective, because I think a lot of times when we think about climate change, we think, oh, there has to be a silver bullet solution. But a lot of the communities across the world, especially in Congo and other places, are being devastated, impacted by, you know, rare earth mineral extraction. So we have to really think about the collective. And I think that's what capitalism fails to incorporate into the moving on for a just transition. And that's why we call a transition, it needs to be just, because if we perpetuate the same economic solutions, quote unquote solutions, and market-based mechanisms that we see in a fossil fuel paradigm into a renewable energy paradigm, or into an energy transition, and we still perpetuate the same systems of harm, we're going to be no better off. And so how do we transition when we have justice in that? And so as Indigenous values and Indigenous knowledge, it ensures looking at that whole collective aspect of this transition. And so for me, it's about bringing the collective along, bringing that ecological knowledge along, and that's how we, in my opinion, are able to address the climate crisis. But if we don't look at it as a collective and through Indigenous values and knowledge, we're not gonna survive, in my opinion, this next phase.
Thank you. I had to request to be unmuted because we have a very nicely controlled room. So Melina, thank you so much for sharing that and also for reiterating and reaffirming the collective nature of Indigenous knowledge. It's so important to continue to reclaim and hold space for the knowledge that was given to us by our ancestors. I'm so pleased and honored to say that Dr. Ihirangi Heke is now in the room. And so I will now, if you don't mind, Ihi, I will come to you for your introduction. But briefly before that, Dr. Heke has been building population health and wellness activities based on traditional environmental knowledge for more than 30 years. In 2007, Dr. Heke developed the Atua Matua Maori Health Net framework so that ancient Maori environmental knowledge could be repurposed into contemporary applications. Dr. Heke, welcome.
Talofa, malo, eh?
Talofa, malo se fua.
Yeah. Koe ne taku mihi karanga kia koutou o ngā kairongo ki tēnei o tātou mai I tātou nei. Mo te whakapae o te aratike ki ngā mōhotanga mātoranga o ngā atua katoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou ki mai tātou. Mea ki pē ki tēnā o te moi mai rā tū heitia te kiingi o Aotearoa o ngai Māori, e haere atu rā. To our Maori king that's recently passed away in New Zealand. Long may he sleep. I'm pleased to be here this morning. I had a few technical problems. I'm in Alaska at the moment. Not that that was the technical issue, it was just the Maori issue of not knowing how to work a phone properly. But I'm here now, and I'm pleased to be here. Some of my background of getting to this point has been not unusual for Maori and for a lot of native people being kicked out of school at a young age, kicked out of home at a young age, going to work for 10 years, realizing that the roles that I had were oppressing some of the things that I needed to contribute to our people. So I got myself educated, traveled to a number of other Indigenous nations to see what they were doing, and spent some time understanding what our environment in Aotearoa, New Zealand, was trying to tell me. And it took me a while to readjust to a different set of glasses and a different set of headphones to listen in a way that translated what it was telling me. But I think I'm getting closer.
Thank you.
I think I'm getting closer. Shall I carry on a little bit more about myself? Are you happy with that?
I'm perfectly happy with that. Thank you so much. And for everyone who's in the room, you're welcome to read more on our speakers' work in the website, in the webpage, if we can reshare that onto the chat. So kia ora, Ihi, and condolences to the loss of the late king. He was a great man who did so much for the Indigenous knowledge in our region. So we are now currently, I'm asking our speakers to delve deeper into the value of the Indigenous knowledge that they have worked with to come up with the climate solutions or to strengthen climate solutions within their respective communities. So Dominique, I will come to you for your perspective.
Thank you very much, Jackson. And I concur with what Melina just mentioned. You know, as the humans, we've complicated our life for nothing. And this has come over through competing natural resources and ourselves. The ego, the human ego, I think has been at the center of the devastations we've been living. And first of all, in a country like DRC in Central Africa, you know, the traditional knowledge and any relevant knowledge which could help address the climate change issues have been either challenged by religions or colonialism or wrong conservation efforts or any other things like that. However, people have maintained their customs and traditional values, which today we think we are coming back to that and say, hey, how can we collect this and use that in the efforts we are putting together to restore or to continue valorizing this knowledge. And the first thing I see that we are looking at in DRC is first restoring landscapes, because by restoring landscapes, you have a chance to go through different areas and communities and cultures and knowledge, and try to respect that in a way that they can be mixed in any other modern knowledge. And here I'm talking about science and new technologies. Unfortunately, those rich cultural values and knowledge are also challenged by the international politics and economics. And my dear sister just mentioned the resources which are sourced here in DRC for the high tech, including minerals. And those, when minerals are extracted in the region, they are mostly extracted by outside people who don't understand the values of the land, the values of sacred sites, but they just look at money. And at the end of the day, even if they left a lot of money in the village, that money is useless, because the cultural values are the identity of those people. And once they lose it, or they lose them, the money cannot buy those knowledge. So our work has been focusing on restoring landscapes, ensuring that we are looking at very long in history of knowledge, but also by restoring different types of ecosystems on the landscape, including mountains, water, rivers, forests. That has helped us actually to understand that not all actions to do biodiversity conservation contribute to maintain the community's welfare. And the welfare is not only material, but also it's spiritual and cultural. And not all development activities, actions contribute to preserve those richness, biodiversity, and cultures. So briefly, I think the efforts we are putting together today is to ensure that we can, look middle way between science and new technologies and traditional knowledge. Because at the end of the day, in this competitive world, we found out that traditional knowledge alone are not enough, as science alone is not enough. So we've been now helping these local communities and the indigenous people to document their traditional knowledge and practices, which they've used for centuries to maintain their system of living, their guardianship and biodiversity, so that we can incorporate that in policies and in conservation approaches, informal conservation approaches. Maybe I stop by there and continue later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dominique. I think the point that you've made on the integration of technology, science, and indigenous knowledge is so important. Alejandro, over to you.
Thank you, and I echo Dominique's reflections. And what I would like to share with you is that that we have to be aware that there is two perspectives. What is, of course, many perspectives. There's two main perspectives. The global one that's more related to all this policy and economical processes that came with globalization and have pushed climate change to this crisis phase that we are facing. And the local one, where climate change is not just an environmental issue, but it is a reflection of colonialism, of extractivism, and racism that continues to play out and maintains these inequities that have historically marginalized indigenous peoples. So all the information that comes from the global processes, with solutions that are more of the white savior fashion, where you have ideas, you have models of solutions that are framed and shaped by interests that are outside from the communities. So I think this discussion should make us rethink in this fundamental relationship that communities have with the land, as Dominique have explained to us. And that the interconnectedness that people and nature is essential insofar, the respect and the values of indigenous peoples that are of reciprocity with the land, maintaining balance, and creating, a spiritual connection to the land is very critical. We have to recognize our responsibilities in terms of keeping that type of relationship as a key element of any type of solution. My own work is similar to that of Dominique. I work on strengthening and supporting indigenous territorialities, where we emphasize the critical role of food, or that food plays in weaving local solutions, where this crisis that we are seeing, which is not only climatic, but it's economic, it's crisis of values, it's crisis that is multidimensional. But as we see that if we find ways of nurturing ourselves, our communities, but also all relations, because the river needs to be nurtured, the rain needs to be nurtured, the forest needs to be nurtured. So every element of Mother Earth needs food as a way of being healthy and keeping the interconnection that happens within all the elements that inhabit this beautiful earth. So by focusing on food and indigenous food systems that are ritualistic, spiritual, keeps the type of species and varieties of food crops, but food crops not only being those like vegetables, but also, the spiritual food that we need. I think we can find and weave solutions that are holistic and integral. And that goes also, to benefit cities and urban centers with real food is needed. And we need to transition into, more sustainable ways of keeping the world alive. I think we live in a bubble. Many say that we already have we have already crossed the tipping point, and that we are just now trying to fool ourselves into finding solutions that are technological and market-based, because we want to keep selfish and want to keep just these generational benefits of the few. but the future is in danger. And Indigenous peoples, as Indigenous peoples, we believe that, you need climate justice that is restorative, where we can work together, everyone, and healing the earth, healing the land. And for that work, we need food to be the center of this healing process. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandro. I think that's something that a lot of Polynesian cultures very much center is food, and specifically a lot of meat-based products. So thank you for sharing. You touched on a point that relates to the success of a project and or developments that is rooted in Indigenous knowledge, or that takes into consideration Indigenous knowledge. So I want to come to Dr. Heke for this one. Exploring climate solutions in the way that we do it in our work is analyzing also the shortcomings of those climate solutions. And often in the Pacific Islands, climate solutions are brought in by development agencies without due consideration of the realities on the ground for Indigenous communities. And being a strong Indigenous leader yourself, I wanted to hear some of those challenges, but also how you've coped with pushing back and ensuring that Indigenous knowledge and values are integrated in a meaningful way into the projects that you work on.
Kia ora no, e mara. For Maori, often when they stand to speak, they'll introduce themselves as a river or as a mountain, but you may not get their name. You can't get any more environmentally centered than that, because we recognize from a systems perspective, if you want to use that word, that there's a overarching connection to environment that defines us, and that in the hierarchical system, we sit a long way down. At the moment, that hierarchy is upside down, where people are at the top. And that's not an Indigenous or even a Maori or a Pacific way of looking at things. Down here in the Pacific, we put taia or environment first. We put water and land first. And so from that perspective, what we've had to work on for the last 10 years is removing people from that concept and shifting our people back to understanding that at the top of that hierarchical system, we have to begin with our understanding of those places. Now, my background is in well-being, and for the last 30 years, I've been working in that. But after 15 years, I realized that I was recolonizing our people by using Pākehā or mainstream ideals or non-Indigenous ideals to affect change in a health system that was flawed. So what that caused me to do was to reconstitute the ways that we understood well-being as a reflection of the level of knowledge that we knew of our water and of our mountains. And so from 2007, our role has been to not mention health anymore, to not mention well-being at all, because those are words that are used to punish Indigenous groups. So we don't begin with a deficit perspective of what some of the issues might be in a community. Instead, we go to what are their strengths? What are the things that they have there that allow them to move forward rather than be overwhelmed with trauma and not know how to progress? And so from that perspective, we've removed people from health completely. And we've made health about or being an incidental outcome of understanding environmental knowledge. And so we teach environmental knowledge, and we'll have 500 people turn up to hear about an environmental aspect of their 50K radius, because it's more important to them than their own personal well-being. And when we said we'd be there for a health meeting, we'd get 10 people. If we're there to talk to them about the environment that has supported them, we get 500. So it's a no-brainer for us that we no longer teach health. We teach environmental science from a Maori perspective. And what that's allowed us to get people to understand is that we're in a state of people being people-centered. It's anthropocentric arrogance, if you want to call it that. And we're having to recenter them back to our ways of knowing. And what this has meant is things like discussions on climate change. I'm in Alaska at the moment at an Alaskan-led climate change conference. There's 600 natives here. And yesterday we had a speaker stand up and say, we've really got to start to address this climate problem. We've got a problem here. And I'm looking at my mate next to me. I said, I don't think climate's the problem. I think people are. Climate doesn't know any different. Climate's doing what it's going to do in relation to what other parts of the climate are doing. And it's the interrelationship between different environments that are trying to balance themselves. And we're the ones that keep unbalancing it. So I said, a mountain doesn't care whether we're here or not. It'll carry on living. So we have to try and get our people to understand some of those concepts of our climate, our environment. It doesn't set out to destroy us. It doesn't have those behavioral issues. It's us that has those. So there's a restructuring of that. But there's also so a big push in our sector area for people to be gathering data, and they objectify data. For us, where data is not an object, it is us. It's our environments being recorded. And so when people talk about data, for Maori, we're related to it. So we can't treat it like something that you use and abuse as you choose. So we've set about trying to build our own data centers on native land that will allow us a way to contribute to climate change through providing our data, our resources of our observations of our environments in ways that we determine as useful. And by that, I mean, we don't envisage that if we build a data center that people can come and take as they please, that will be defined by environment, which means that if we have an incoming tide, that may be the day that we take data in from different Indigenous groups and store it, because that's when sustenance is provided to other animals. So it's a logical rationale for how we would gather data. But then we would push it out maybe on an outgoing tide when there's an opportunity for others to benefit from what they've learned from that. So it means that we're being led by environment, and we're changing our structures around data. We're changing back to ways of regarding information as a relationship with our relatives. And it's been quite a shift for our people because they want to stay people-centered. This is an opportunity to change that. So we're pushing the boundaries here in Aotearoa. But I think the irony is that probably to you, my relation from Samoa, at a blood memory, you recognize what I'm saying here.
Very much so. Very much so. Thank you so much for sharing. You know, one of the founding principles of our language in Samoa is very much centered on land, sea, and sky. Without the natural systems operating in its natural and fully functioning manner, we lose a lot of our oral traditions and the artistry by which our history is recorded and based upon. So I very much hear what you're saying, and this intrinsic link between environment and language, but also our people and respecting the lands is so important. So Dominic, I'm going to come to you as it relates to this question. And I really want to delve a little bit deeper in terms of climate solutions on the cultural protocol. You've mentioned the approaches that you have taken with the projects that you've worked on. How do you capture and ensure that climate solutions and Indigenous knowledge and climate solutions are fairly reflected while observing cultural protocol in a way that does not dishonor or disrespect the communities that we work with?
Thank you very much. That's a big question. I wish I had a good answer for that.
5 hours, please, Dominic.
Actually, you know, it's in our days, it's difficult to say we have only the Indigenous people's answer without mixing that with something else. Because at the end of the day, we found out that we have key stakeholders who put efforts together to reach there, and first as the Indigenous people and local communities contributing with their knowledge and practices and large information they have on how they've been processing the land and seeds and everything. But also we have researchers who need to inform and to recall if something was forgotten, what happens here and there, what happened in in years. But we have media. Media is very important and key in these key stakeholders. The government when it comes to policies, because policies can impede traditional knowledge to be applied if those policymakers are not joining and are not on board. Working with these people, all these key stakeholders together, we found out that Indigenous people detain the biggest and richest knowledge when it comes to overcome the climate change issues. What we've done right now in Congo, because if you Google Congo or you want to learn something about Congo, what comes out is war, killing, and it's hard to find out that there is something positive going on the ground to preserve the land, to preserve the cultures and everything. And that's where I think the journalism and media come in to ensure that they can also share positive information which have been made by traditional people and Indigenous people as well. In Eastern DRC, for example, due to all the issues we've passed through, political unrest and those kind of things, we've lost a big number of wildlife, including endemic species like the Grauris gorillas. We've lost about 77% of the population in DRC. And I'm mentioning wildlife because there is a big connection between humans and wildlife when it comes to perpetuate their traditional knowledge and cultures. And 7 chiefdoms came together and said, we know that this population of Grauris gorillas have been decimated because of, first of all, because of losing habitat. And today, they are putting 1 million hectares of traditional lands, bringing that into conservation to preserve the remaining population of Eastern lowland gorillas. And of course, with other species, because most of those species, some are totemic species, meaning that they are used in cultures, in traditions, in rituals, but also some of them can tell them what is going to happen tomorrow or what happened the other day. So they use a lot of wildlife species and plants to tell, even to predict how things are going to happen. If, for example, we have a chance to have the forest back or not, So those efforts of not only looking at traditions which can be impeded by religions, as I said before, but also putting practical things together, like this 1 million hectares of land is also, have a lot of sacred sites, which actually help them to perpetuate what could be lost in different issues. And those sacred sites are essential to maintain their knowledge and also to transmit that from generation to generations, because many of them don't have access to education, and they have their own way of communicating this to the younger generation and so on. So I'd say it's very difficult in some ways to maintain those knowledge, and we are working now with the government of DRC to ensure that policies are in place to protect those Indigenous people and their cultures and their land, in order to see in a few years to come if we can do some comparative studies looking at how the lands governed and managed by by Indigenous people have made progress into preserving biodiversity and knowledge and cultures versus protected areas which are managed by governmental agencies. Because those people are voiceless. They cannot tell the government, hey, look, this is not working. So they have to do something which is working so that they can show by action that, look, what we are doing versus what is happening in that region. So some of those are a few examples that I can cite. I know we are looking at time, but I know we can go on and discussing different and several examples that are being used by Indigenous people here to address climate change.
Thank you, Dominic. I appreciate you sharing that. And I do apologize to all our speakers. We're very limited in time. But Alejandra, I wanted to come to you on this same issue of capturing traditional knowledge while also ensuring that it's not taken advantage of in the future when it is perhaps utilized, or there is a chance of utilization by Western-based projects.
Yeah, I think, in science or modern science, because we have to recognize that, there is many streams of knowledge, systems. You can have Ayurvedic medicine that's different from Chinese medicine, or modern medicine as practiced in the West. Each one of those has their own epistemology and ontology, and the architecture of those systems may be different, and the application would have processes that differ each from another. What we call traditional knowledge, in my view, is different from indigenous knowledge, which is, there's, as you may see in the discussions or debates in the World Intellectual Property Organization on traditional knowledge, you're going to have countries like China or India advocating for the recognition of traditional knowledge, which is not necessarily indigenous knowledge, that has a more deeper connection to the land, and it's maintained today by many communities around the world that continue to live in a relationship of deep connection and reciprocity with the land. So while indigenous people are facing daily challenges that are related to changing conditions of climate that affect crops, that affect their herds, that affect their livelihoods, they do have methods, tools, and processes that responding to those challenges on a daily basis. And they know they have their own also tools and systems of storing and managing that knowledge that are not necessarily related to databases or to systems of knowledge management that are associated with modern science. And those, in the past have inspired science. You can talk about agroforestry, or you can talk about other types of agroecology, other types of solutions that people are using now. But locally, there's taxonomies that people manage continually to organize their knowledge and produce responses, create evidence that the community understands and are used to create responses that are locally valid and very powerful. So, when you have a scientist or researcher or an economical entrepreneur or an entrepreneur that comes into the community with a different set of ideas, of course, they will look into this rich knowledge that stays in the community and will try to tap into it using their own tools and knowledge. Their own tools and methods. So with the idea of either helping, which it doesn't, or of making it into an economical gain. So therefore, I think we need protocols that are based on customary laws and customary institutions that any individual or entity that comes to the community must respect and abide by those protocols that can regulate this exchange of ideas, knowledge, experiences between the communities and external actors, and that those must be based on the local perception of justice, of equity, and the local perceptions of how you evaluate, from the local biodiversity to its applications at a local level. And where in most communities, those do not have an economical value, but a spiritual value, and that are sacred, and that must be respected. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandro. I do appreciate that point on the spiritual knowledge and cultural knowledge as opposed to the traditional way of looking at it from Western perspectives. A very good way of perceiving that in Samoa, at least, is if you go into a village, the largest and most Western looking house that will have great value in the United States or in the developed world is not necessarily the house of the highest chief or the most knowledgeable orator or the most respected elder on the island. In fact, the house of that particular chief might be the most humblest looking house in the village. So I think that contextual understanding of our indigenous and traditional values on the ground is so important to be considered in projects. Melina, I'm going to come to you with a question that we received from the audience. And it is an extension of the question I've asked earlier. It's looking at how do you bridge the gap between indigenous communities and non-indigenous communities, and ensuring that you're honoring indigenous knowledge while also integrating perhaps the benefits from non-indigenous knowledge and communities.
Well, the work we do at Sacred Earth is that we try to ensure that we are following the lead of indigenous communities that we work with. And so communities invite us in to put up projects with them, and we build capacity with the communities as we build those projects. So we won't build anything or come into the community with kind of like a presupposed idea of what we think works for the community. We take the direction of the community. And so I think that's a little bit different than sometimes Western ideology, which we've definitely seen here in so-called Canada, where we have these imposed systems from the outside coming into our communities and telling us what the solutions are to our problems. And so as an Indigenous women-led organization, we don't presuppose that we know the solutions to the communities that are inviting the other Indigenous communities, inviting us into their nations to help implement climate solutions. And so we take direction first and foremost. And I think that's an inherent Indigenous value, where we don't think that we know the solution, that it's the community that knows the problem. So therefore they know the solution, and we are just there to help facilitate, find funding, build capacity, build projects, because we've been able to build those within our own communities, and we're bringing that knowledge from our community. And so that's something that I do notice as a difference between non-Indigenous allies sometimes coming in and telling us how things should work, as opposed to building those solutions within community. And so that's what we really want to see, is having those climate solution champions, if you want to call that, from the community, building those projects in community. And so we don't always see that sometimes. And so another thing that I see a difference is the idea of what I've heard also is the idea of reciprocity. So when we are protecting our homelands, when we are building projects, we don't take from the land, we take and give, and there's that reciprocity that we don't see exhibited in the systems of capitalism, which is just take and not giving back. It's like taking the most and giving back the least, and some that equates to a profit margin. And so the idea of reciprocity is ensuring that when we come into communities and work with other Indigenous nations, that there's the reciprocity of giving and receiving at the same time, and it's not just one-sided of a take situation that we've definitely experienced here in 150 years of colonialism in so-called Canada. Another inherent value that I also see Indigenous peoples and like our ways of knowing and being is really understanding interconnectivity and interconnection, and that we can exist without every single living being. And even within our ceremonial spaces, we in our ceremonial lodges, we open and close. Even just to open the door, we say all my relations, and that isn't just something that we just say, it's something that we feel deeply and we know deeply, as in that means that we're acknowledging every single living being. And that's even including rocks. You know, we see rocks as living beings. They give us, you know, they are animate objects in our language. So there's just that idea of interconnection and this like need for a paradigm shift for colonial and Western values to really understand that the Indigenous knowledge, again, like what I said earlier is, and I can't repeat enough, is that, you know, that we existed on our homelands for millennia here in so-called Canada, and now we have 150 years of hyper-extractivism and hyper-capitalism and hyper-productivity and individualism, and we see, you know, wildfires every single summer now burning in our homelands where our families evacuating. You know, and so I know that every Indigenous person on this call knows that deep despair that you feel when you've worked really hard to protect your homelands, and yet you're still experiencing the impacts of the climate crisis. And also for us in the tar sands, where we have one of the largest industrial impact zones on the planet, where we fought for a very long time to protect our homelands, and yet we still see this destruction, right, of our homelands. And so we're not even able to sometimes live our cultural values and our spiritual values on our homelands. And so I think that's something that we've been working with our non-Indigenous allies over the years to teach that paradigm shift that needs to be seen of how to work with Indigenous communities and work in not only partnership, but in brotherhood with one another, as you know, there's that way that we don't live in this pyramid system. We live in what we call a sacred hoop, of that every single living being is just as equal and important in that hoop of sacredness here on Mother Earth. And we don't have this hierarchy that is such a Western colonial system. So I'll end there, but I'm going to just also share the Just Transition Guide in the chat, because I mentioned it. I said I would mention it early, send it earlier, so I'll just put it there if folks want to see it. Thank you.
Thank you, Melina. I appreciate what you've shared here. And it sounds like there is this general consensus among our speakers today that a consultative process is really important when working with Indigenous communities and when utilizing or working with traditional knowledge. So Dr. Heke, can I come to you about this particular approach on like not one solution fits all, and how you've approached that?
Yeah, sure. One of the things that we did was to take an overarching view to begin with, that there's particular environments that we start from, and they're either land, water, or star-based. Exactly as you said, Lang, when we're looking at those, that's our beginning point. And when we do that, it removes some of the gender, age, ethnicity issues, because it's pure knowledge from environment. And that allows us to start, so that we're not having arguments about who has rights or controls its environmental knowledge. We begin from. We then very quickly drop down into a second tier level that looks at what's the 50K radius of that information. And the reason we do that is that we then tie in that group that are from that district in a way that means that they'll sustain the efforts because they recognize themselves in it. And that's critical, because we start wide, we then drop down into quite a tight circle of showing them things from their environment that they didn't know. And once we do that, they're ours for life, because now we know something that they didn't know about their village. And it's from an environmental perspective of either water, land, or stars. Then very quickly, what we drop down into after that is, what are we supposed to know from that piece of environmental knowledge in that 50K radius that can contribute to the perpetuation of our people? And so we don't leave that one to chance. We tell them exactly what we want them to know from learning about that tree, or from that fish, or from that spider. And we teach this into our schools, and are in 70 schools in New Zealand where we're teaching them how to read trees again, how to read birds, how to read insects, and how to read fish. And this is something we used to do, and it went away. So that's our third tier level. And then the last two tiers is that we then look for a way to action that. And that action is something that they get to choose. And if it's something that is inconsistent with what you would have thought Indigenous process looks like, that's okay to us. It doesn't matter. If they want to go snowboarding and look at how we can understand the function of snow and it being our oldest ancestor, because it may have fallen a million years ago and still there in a form that's solid, that's okay. We don't mind that. But it keeps our kids there because the recruitment agent is going snowboarding. But we're actually after health by stealth, and they don't know that. So we're teaching them things that we want them to know, but they're getting it through a medium of a snowboard. And the last thing that we consider is, how do we time it? And we look for indications from an environment that tell us now's the time to deliver. And it's not when people want it, it's when environment's prepared to give it. And so we have to keep going back to our knowledge systems of understanding that mātauranga or environmental knowledge exists, but we have to go through the door to engage with it. And from there, we can understand and develop capacity in our people. But it shouldn't end there. And this is where Māori are pushing the boundaries, because, and I say that with all humility, I know I'm not being arrogant, but we're pushing the boundaries because we've moved from trauma, and we're in the space of, what are we going to do? And when we look at that part of timing and when we're going to deliver ideas, our time is now to look at mātauranga as the knowledge point, mōhiotanga, which is the building of capacity, but it's the third phase that's the critical one. And in there is dynamic capability. So I see a lot of Indigenous groups globally trying to build capacity amongst their communities, which is awesome. But for Māori, we've moved into a third phase, which is the dynamic capability of taking things from the past, from our elders from 100, 1,000 years ago, and reconstituting it into contemporary applications of, what does this mean for the well-being of our kids when they engage with social media? What does this mean for our ways of applying past thinking into environmental solutions today? And when we find a model from the past, it means that our platform is authentic to our ways of knowing, and then we can continue onwards. And that's a processing issue, not a content issue. And what we're finding with some of our mates is they're stuck on content and trying to build more what ifs, or how about this, or here's the solution. But the platform fundamentally hasn't been built. And that's a why question. And the why question for a lot of them is, why would we do this thing? And when they try and answer that, it's because it's people need this. If you start from a position of we're doing this for people, we've already failed. So as Māori, why we do this is for the sake of water, or for the sake of mountains. And if we start from that central tenet of a platform that is consistent with our Indigenous thought from 1,000 years ago, we never fail, because there's a model that's already been proven over thousands of years. And you can't get any more wisdom than wisdom from a mountain. But if you ask a person, it's short term. So hopefully that answers some of your questions there, my mate.
Whawhitai, I think you definitely did, and far and beyond the call of duty on that one. So I appreciate that. It sounds to me that you have taken Indigenous systems and strengthen the way that the programs that you're working on now in a modern governance system to work. And this is very much in line also with something that Alejandra has mentioned, and also Dominique has spoken about the governments of Congo working with them to ensure that when they work with Indigenous communities, it is mindful. It reminds me of when I was a stringer for Wall Street Journal, and the Bangkok bureau chief wanted to come and interview some high chiefs in my home country. So, I picked him up from the airport and he said, I need to speak to 3 high chiefs. The problem is, ethically, in journalism, you cannot give gifts, right? That is unethical. But in my culture, you cannot enter the house of a high chief without a gift. So I had to have this bureau chief turn a blind eye as I bought corned beef, bread, and various other food items to present to the chief. I said, I don't know how you're going to expense the corned beef, but it's been given to the high chief. And only with that cultural protocol and understanding was he then able to give the answers and to speak to, to the American bureau chief in a way that will be acceptable to our culture. So I do, recognize what you've just shared here. Now, we have 20 minutes left. I'm being strictly guided by our team on this. And Dr. Heke, before you came, I said, I need just 3 hours for an introduction alone, because in our culture, we have to acknowledge all the fish, the birds, and all the leaves and the trees. Unfortunately, we don't have that due to the systems we now operate in. But I want to ask this very important question that really integrates a lot of the questions that have come through our chat. And I do apologize to our audience. I'm not able to ask all of these questions, but I hope that in this question, our speakers are able to address some of those. And it's really on the allies and the non-Indigenous folks who work with Indigenous communities. What are some of your tips? How can, as my colleague Seth here said, how can white folks work better with Indigenous communities? So I'd really appreciate if you can just highlight some of the tips that you have. Like, so for me, for American or Western journalists that come into my island, you definitely need to buy some bread and corned beef before you interview a high chief. That's a very practical tip to a solution. So I'll come to you, Melina, first.
A practical tip to do what exactly, though?
So when working on climate projects and approaching Indigenous communities, how can non-Indigenous folks do it in a way that is mindful and honors the Indigenous communities that they are going into?
Yeah, there's so many things, I guess. You know what I really love seeing when non-Indigenous allies work with our communities is uplifting the people in those communities and moving alongside and taking direction from the people within the communities, as opposed to coming in and thinking that they could and or should lead. So yeah, I guess the practical tip is what we've been pushing our non-Indigenous allies in the environmental justice movement for, close to 15 plus years I've been in it, is to build capacity within community, not just like extractively tokenizing one person or speaker. Oh, you're high capacity, you're high functioning individual, so you should just speak for all Cree people, or you should speak for all Dene people. And it's just this tokenistic, extractive way where you're actually removing that person from their community and uplifting them to to help you run your campaign, or help you to follow, I guess, achieve your objectives. And I think that's actually really, again, it's the same colonial extractive values that doesn't actually help and bring capacity back into the community. So if you actually want to work with Indigenous communities, it's going to take more resources. It's going to take more support for that community to actually come alongside, as opposed to just thinking that you can engage one person on behalf of how many hundreds of peoples that person might represent and shouldn't just represent. They're like, again, we are collective peoples. And so And that's the thing that I have found very frustrating working with the environmental movement, is that they don't want to build capacity within our communities. They want to extract the one person and build into what they're working on, as opposed to working in true allyship, in my opinion, of actually building back into those communities that they're actually extracting from. So I would say that.
Thank you, Melina. I think such an important point is the tokenism bit. Just because you speak to one person from that community doesn't mean they reflect all the values of that particular community. So we'll take that. Thank you so much for sharing. Alejandro, would really appreciate your perspective on this.
Yeah, I think above and foremost, people go into communities to report or create a story should be respectful of the local culture. And I would recommend that they work with Indigenous members, prioritize collaborative storytelling. Not just because, one view, it's not enough, but it creates or provides the authenticity of the narrative, and helps to strengthen or empower local Indigenous voices, and also shapes a story that's more accurate. Also, to do that, they need to invest more time and the understanding of the local context. So there's not just about doing research, but also spending some time in the community and perhaps attending local events and listening discussions that are related to their interest. So that will allow the people not to stereotype and have a more in-depth insights in terms of Indigenous approaches and their own systems of stewardship. And finally, I think it's very important that people contribute to reject this white saviorism that's pretty much into the reporting of solutions. You're going to have always an individual that's doing something unique, and that individual comes from outside and create those solutions. So they should be cautious in the narrative that frame individuals and organizations as saviors, and rather to promote restorative justice, so that we repair relationships and heal together the problems that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandro. I think that's such an important point, to make sure that you're not only considerate of the systems in place, but also maintaining that relationship by respecting and honoring that community when going in for the first time. So Dominique, I'd love to hear your perspective.
Thank you very much. And I think, as you mentioned it before, gifts, presents are part of several cultures around the globe. But referring to a question in the chat about corruption, corruption is a crime, not only for development, but also for the integrity of Indigenous people. And that has happened in ways that many people didn't know that they're corrupting in another way, because when you come in a village, they need, for example, 2 days to talk to the ancestors, to allow you to access information or the site or anything else. And because you've provided them with a kilo of salt or some t-shirts, They said, oh, we want to be nice and very kind to this person, and they do it. And that exists also in the modern society, where when you talk about corruption, we are not talking about the 500 francs that a taxman give to a policeman on the road, but we are talking about the million of US dollars offered by companies to officials in Congo. And unfortunately, when we talk about corruption, we don't talk about the people who are corrupting, but we talk about the people who are corrupted. And I consider corruption as a pregnancy. When a girl is pregnant, you don't blame the girl alone, because this happened between two people. And until we continue looking at corruption, focusing on one part and not on another part, we not fix it. We have to blame both parties, the corrupted person and the person, the companies which is corrupting the other person. But coming back to the question itself, I think it's possible that non-Indigenous people can work with Indigenous people. That requires humility, integrity, and reciprocity. And because communities, they trust very quickly. And unfortunately, the people we trust are the same people who damage, our values, our richness, everything we provide to those people. I think I cannot say it better than what Alejandro just mentioned, that, and I think Melina said it as well, the fact of people go to extract, I want this because I want to use it to something else. And coming back to another question about traditional medicine and modern medicine, is the same thing. How can we trust companies? We give them our knowledge, and at the end of the day, they gain more and leave nothing in the village, although we've provided the biggest knowledge and material to make the medicine and everything. So it's still challenging, because we're still living in this world of ego, of people thinking that they are smarter than others. They require more resources than others. And I think that is not helping. And even when it comes to climate change issues, we have to ensure that the fact of reciprocity, as Alejandra said it, is really respected.
Thank you, Dominique. I appreciate your answer. I think we have about a few minutes left, about 10 minutes left. And so Dr. Ihi, and also you might notice I'm using Dr. Ihi's name because it's very exciting for me to actually say a Maori name in a webinar. So if I can come to you with this first two-part question, because I know that Tangaroa has equipped you and I with long-term memory. So I'm going to start with the first question, which I would love to hear your answer to, is tips for non-Indigenous folks working in our communities, just practical tips on how to do this in a mindful and respectful manner. And then the last question I'd like for you to answer is really, how can journalists report better on climate solutions in Indigenous communities? Thank you.
Yeah, kia ora no. Before I begin, I just need to acknowledge you, Langi, and also our Dominic, Alejandro, and all of the Melinda. I'm humbled to be on the same space as you fellas. So I just wanted to show my appreciation for being included in today as well before I carried on, which was remiss of me. There's a couple of things happening in this space that are interesting to me. Is for Māori, we've been confrontational for a long time. And part of the ability to work with white fellas, Pākehā, Haole, Palangi, is that we have been the barrier to that because we're still angry. And so when they come into our communities, often, occasionally, they turn up with good intent. And we have to filter through that sometimes. And for Māori, we've been the barrier to moving forward because we haven't been able to transition. And so part of being able to work with white fellas is that we have to work on ourselves first. And as Maori, what we're trying to do is move on from trauma and into a place of hope and aspirations for all humanity. And we're just starting to arrive there now as Maori, that we're realizing that we've been so angry for so long, we may have missed opportunities to work with some pālangi that have got good ideas. And in this way of looking at our world, we have to believe that the intent of them coming in is sometimes going to be beneficial, and we'll have to filter through that. But if we don't give them a chance, it will never happen. A part of that is the ability of people to listen. And one of the things that, or one of the people that's a big part of today is Seth. And I just mentioned this to Seth earlier today. I said, you know what I like about you, Seth, is you don't talk. You wait and you listen. And I said, I don't come across many fellas like that. They want to tell you how awesome they are for 10 minutes first. But with him, he showed consideration of another person's view. And I don't find that very often in Pākehā either. They want to tell you all the great things they're doing. So listening is a good thing. Being in that place of establishing rapport and a platform to even get to the point may take time. And factoring in that ability to sit, listen, and spend time getting to know a person before you ask for anything is critical. So we've had to move into that space of hope, realize that we're a barrier to that, but maintain the knowledge, whoever's white fellas on this meeting, that whatever you say, we're going to take it personally. And that means that sometimes if you say things that you think are okay because you represent a corporation, if you're standing in front of us, then you're going to be the target. So tread carefully of what you say. You know, those things of considering that are important for journalists as well. But what we've learned to do more recently with journalists is, this might sound rude to say this to you, Langi, but we're learning how to manage upwards. Which means we tell journalists when we want them to come, not the other way around. And we figure out the ones that are sensitive to the ways that we work. And those are the ones we shoulder tap first. And we say, this event is happening. These are the people that will be here. These are the things you need to know. Be here at this time. And then we feed them the things that we want to manage. Otherwise, what happens is if journalists turn up of their own volition because they've heard it through someone else, then they don't get the story that we want to deliver. So we manage that media access more tightly by finding out who the journalists are that we can work with. And then it can filter out to the others later. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you so much, Ihi, for mentioning that. I think that's so important for Indigenous communities to work with journalists that they trust and who also respect the values that your communities and our communities have. So, Seth, I think we are at time. Am I right?
Yes, we are.
Yes. Okay, so I would like to take this opportunity to thank you, Melina, Alejandro, Dominique, and thank you, Dr. Ihirangi, for your time and imparting the knowledge that you have shared today. I apologize if anything I have said or these organizations have said have disrespected any aspect of the knowledge that you hold and the knowledge that you have inherited from our ancestors. So Seth, did you want to wrap up or?
Yeah, I'll just for one moment, I'd like to say something,
Sure.
and then I'll pass it to our panelists to close. But an invitation to those on the call, all of our lineages go back to some indigeneity somewhere and are all connected to that indigeneity somewhere. And that indigeneity was broken at some point by systems. My Irish ancestors probably had their forests cut down and burned by Romans. And then, you know, they lost their connection to the forest. And what is being shared by so many folks here are people who have maintained those connections through so much oppression, right? And have been able to continue it. And so it's such a gift to be able to reconnect to knowledge that I think is in everybody's bones still, and wisdom that is in everyone's bones. And it's a lot more work, and it's a lot of work, and it requires a lot of humility to, you know, it's like you're the the salmon and all the dams have been built. And you're trying to swim back upstream, but there's all these dams in the way in our histories. And so it's such a gift to be able to sort of bypass or go through the cracks in some of these dams and connect with folks like our panelists here who are maintaining those traditions and offering them back to us to come back home, possibly to our own ancestry and our own lineage. And so just a lot of gratitude to you all for being here and sharing, and thank you to so many people who've stayed on this call for an hour and a half and just listened with openness and curiosity. Just wanted to end, and so thank you all for being here, and it's always it's a real gift. And so I don't know if
Thank
any
you,
of our
Seth.
close,
Thank
but
you.
there.
Thank you, Seth. I will just like to go around with our speakers one more for just brief closing remarks before I end this call. Over to you, Alejandro.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you and everyone that have been in this, listening this reflection. We thank you.
Thank you. Melina?
I was laughing at your comment, the other one where you said that you can't tell where a chief would live in the community. And it's the same thing. I was laughing last week too, because I brought journalists up to my community to profile Sacred Earth, and I showed them my dad's trailer, and it's like one of the most wretched trailer, and he's the chief of our community. And I was like, it's just so true, it's not about, having a big fancy home. It's about, carrying yourself in a humble way. And he was hidden from residential schools. At my grandparents could have been basically jailed, but they kept him hidden so he could maintain stories from before the last ice age. And and you wouldn't know by looking at his house that he's this like really amazing storyteller and language keeper. But it's funny how capitalism has made us view these Western ways of just uplifting wealth in such dysfunctional ways. So thank you for your joke. It made me laugh, and I totally related to it. And I'm really happy to be here and just listen to everyone else on the call and their wealth of knowledge and communicating their ways of knowing and being. It really resonated with me, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you, Melina. And Dominic, before I come to you, I just want to thank you for addressing the question that was in the chat on corruption. I deliberately did not ask that question because often we center the negative when it comes to Indigenous folks. And I'm so grateful that you honored that question and answered it. So I'll come to you for your final remarks.
Thank you very much for organizing this discussion and inviting me to share my community's knowledge and perspective on climate change. I know it's not ending here. The discussion will continue until we can provide solutions to this global issue. It's a global issue. It requires a global solution as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And to my brother from Maori, from New Zealand, the land of long white cloud, over to you.
Yeah, kia ora. Hey, Melina, I was laughing myself when I keep hearing you say that so-called Canada. That one was cracking me up too. I want to thank you, all of the people that have come along today. My hope from this is that we build a number of secret agents, white fellas that spread this idea without other people knowing they're doing it. So my aspirations and hopes is that there's heaps of palangi that are on this call that will go on to transmit our idea. Because if we turn up Langi and looking like we do, then they're going to say, well, you were always going to say that. But if a pākehā turns up, a white fella, and says what we've just talked about, it'll get heard. And that's the point of today, is that we've now got, some 100 other people that know this message and can deliver it as white people to other white people, and it will be heard. So that's a critical part of today. And I know this is a real gift, getting to talk with you. Finally, I hope you took notice of my T-shirt. We made this T-shirt for the Inuit people up here, and particularly the Yupik. And I had an elder come up to me last night who's Yupik, and he says, what does that mean? I says, it means Yupik and friendly. So we've made these T-shirts for a couple of the locals up here, and we've been giving them away today, and they're pretty happy with those. But ngamihi kia koe, e mara mo tō tautoko ki tēnei, e me koutou katoa tēnā koutou kura mai tātou. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ihi. I will be expecting my T-shirt in the mail soon. And so without further ado, once again, I want to thank you, Alejandro, Melinda, Dominique, and Dr. Ihi for your time. Faftai Te Lava. It has been a great honor for us to hear your perspectives and to also host this so that we may hear from you. Again, Faftai Te Lava. Thank you.
Kia ora.